So today we're talking about extended producer responsibility and an update on a webinar that we did last May, I think it is now. Much of today will focus on packaging and packaging waste, because that's where a lot of the activity is happening at the moment in the EU because of the implementation or the imminent implementation of PPWR, packaging and packaging waste regulation. But obviously there's also EPR for batteries and electronic waste, and because of the eco design for sustainable products regulation that's in force, we'll start seeing EPR in place for those products that are within the initial scope of ESPR. So textiles, tyres, furniture, mattresses, things like that. So, but much of today is going to focus on packaging and packaging waste. So I have pulled together a very brief agenda, doesn't look that brief actually, on the origins of EPR, so kind of like where it sits in the scheme of wider EU regulation. What it, where's it coming from? Why is the EU pushing this? We'll talk about its purpose and its targets. We'll talk about how it's changed from the existing waste directive, how it's starting to evolve with the emergence of PPWR and ESPR. And then we'll do a deep dive into these markets that I've mentioned. Not a huge amount has changed from last year for these markets because they also are waiting for PPWR's delegated acts to come into place so they know how they need to change their local systems. Remember that this is regulation, PPWR is regulation, obviously, so that is directly applicable across the whole of the EU. So we'll see less regulatory divergence, but there are still elements of the regulation that member states can kind of tweak nationally. So they're waiting for PPWR to kind of change their EPR schemes. We'll talk about the situation with regard for authorised representatives. Traditionally, authorised representatives have been needed for if you're placing batteries or battery waste, or if you're placing electronic goods or electronic goods waste on the EU market. PPWR brings the requirement for an authorised representative into place for packaging and packaging waste as well, so we'll talk about that. We'll also cover off the GTD platform. Obviously, that's our proprietary regulatory compliance platform. And we've been inundated with requests from existing clients and those that aren't clients currently to understand what the platform is going to do with regard to EPR. So we'll cover off our plans and what's underway at the moment. And then we'll talk about the practicalities, how from where you sit today, how do you determine that you're in scope? How do you go about calculating the fees or the levies, and importantly, taking advantage of those eco-modulated levies or fees that PPWR brings in and that member states are going to have to adopt in their own fee structure. And then we'll talk about just generally, how can you prepare for these two pieces of pretty heavyweight regulation, ESPR and PPWR, that are transforming EPR structure, if you like. I always think about, and it helps in my mind, so it may help you, if you think about the ESPR is the regulation for sustainable regulation for products. PPWR is that equally heavyweight regulation for packaging and packaging waste. And then EPR kind of sits in the middle of the two, and it's like a framework. It's a framework that enables those two pieces of regulation to work and enables the member states to have that kind of fee structure and that mechanism to charge producers for the waste that they place on the market, be that product waste or packaging waste. That's how it helps me to understand it. It may help you too. So what are the origins of EUPR. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to get into the nitty-gritty. But basically, at the very heart of it is the Waste Framework Directive. And I've given you the Waste Framework hierarchy diagram here as well. And the directive really lays down some principles, basic waste management principles. So it demands, and it's been in place for some time now, it demands that waste be managed without endangering human health and harming the environment, that it be managed without risks to water, air, soil, plants or animals, and without causing a nuisance through noise or odours, and without adversely affecting the countryside or places of special interest. So that's the Waste Framework Directive, and that's pretty much the basis of EPR, if you like. There are legislative and non-legislative measures linked to EPR as well. So, you know, it proposes that that development, production and marketing of products and components of those products, like packaging, are suitable for multiple use, that they contain as much as possible recycled materials, that they're technically durable to extend the life cycle of those products, that they're easily repairable, and that after they become waste, that they're suitable for reuse and recycling in order to facilitate that proper implementation of the waste hierarchy. There are a number of there are a number of schemes in place already. So like I say, we've got batteries, we've got waste electronic goods and so on. But the directive traditionally has allowed member states to kind of transpose, that directive into their national law, which is why we've got this kind of patchwork framework around the EU of EPR. And in fact, Denmark was only implemented their EPR scheme last year. They were the last. Every member state had to comply by 2025, and Denmark was right up against it. So, you know, we've got a situation whereby you'll be charged fees for a certain type of packaging material going into France, but you won't be charged for that packaging material going into Sweden. You'll have variations in terms of the fees that are charged. You even still now, you have, despite PPWR coming down the line, you've still got variation in terms of whether or not you need an authorized representative in certain markets. So there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of difference between the member states because they've adhered to the directive, which isn't directly applicable. You know, it's not regulation. PPWR makes at least the handling of the packaging and packaging waste directly applicable across the EU. So therefore EPR schemes have to catch up. But obviously in terms of their fee structure and so on, it's always going to be down to member states because they've got their own recycling facilities, their recycling targets and so on, and the costs associated with managing those. So you're never going to get harmonization across the fee structure, but what you will get is harmonization across the kind of eco-modulated elements. So, you know, you will see kind of like discounts on definitely packaging, sustainable packaging, plastic packaging. You will see the same kind of like discounts applied universally across the EU. So in terms of regulation, obviously the whole purpose of EPR is that it incentivizes companies to design products that are more durable, more repairable, more recyclable throughout their life cycle and have significantly less impact or environmental impact throughout their life cycle. And what it does is it's kind of like the producer pays principle. So it pushes the responsibility for that sustainable design and management of products and packaging further up the supply chain. It's that producer pays principle. So instead of, you know, placing the cost burden on the consumer, it places the cost burden on the actual producer, and that producer will talk about how do you define who is the producer. And it basically, the whole purpose of it is it helps the EU hit its recycling targets, if you like, and promotes that whole circular economy, which, you know, we talk about that a lot with ESPR, that whole circularity of design. It's the same with packaging. If you look at the packaging and packaging waste regulation, it talks about recyclability, but it also talks about reusability. So even in the case of, you know, what we call tertiary packaging, which is that transport packaging, like pallets and crates and things like that, it talks about, you know, the number of turns that can have, if you like, in the market. So, you know, we will see pallets extend their lifetime, we'll see crates extend their lifetime, that kind of stuff. So EPR today, under the directive, it's mandatory across the whole of the EU now. I know from speaking to a number of clients and companies reaching out to us now that they're not compliant. I would say the vast majority of companies are not compliant. I wouldn't say panic at all, but PPWR coming into force on the 12th of August really solidifies EPR across the whole of the EU. So we need to be prepared for that. If your products are still getting in to the EU without being questioned, then that's more through luck and good fortune than it is through kind of like good management. So it is mandatory across the whole of the EU now. As of the 12th of August, unless you are compliant, then you won't be able to place those packaged goods or packaging waste on the EU market. As I say, that transposition into local law, Denmark was the final one in 2025. That's in place now. And as I say, there's different requirements across all of the different member states. And we're doing a deep dive into some of those, so we'll talk about those. But what are the fundamentals? Essentially, there is a national register now in each member state, and the registration has become harmonized really across the EU member states. So you have to register as a producer in each member state where you place packaged goods or packaging waste on that market. And you have to register with what's called a producer responsible organization. So if I was to mention some of the names of the most commonly known ones, you'd instantly recognize them probably if you've already done some research around EPR. Quite often, the PRO, or the Producer Responsible Organisation, will register you on the national register anyway. You need to check their terms and conditions to see that they do that, because being on the national register is paramount as part of PPWR compliance. When you register with the Producer Responsible Organisation, they'll issue you a license number, and that license number usually needs to appear on your packaging to demonstrate to customs and the competent authorities that you're registered with the Producer Responsible Organisation, and as such you're compliant with EPR, and it demonstrates that you report on the volumes of packaging and packaging waste that you place on the market, and as a result you'll be invoiced according to those volumes and you pay fees, traditionally annually. It is changing with PPWR. So some member states are switching to a 6-monthly report schedule. Hungary is kind of like the outlier and is moving to a monthly report schedule, which is over the top, but there you go. And even still now, we've got a kind of difference between the member states as to whether or not they're imposing the requirement to have an authorized representative. If to actually be the intermediary between you and the PRO, they essentially report. You compile your data, you give it to the authorized representative, and they submit it to the PRO. Anyway, it's an additional level of complexity that really isn't needed, but it's as a result of us being outside of the EU. Basically, we're no longer a local company. Having said that, if you looked at the PPWR regulation, the PPWR regulation does state that member states should should insist that other member states placing waste or packaging waste on their market should appoint an authorised representative. And then it says that they can do the same for third countries. So that interpretation of that particular point in PPWR is up for each member state to interpret. And when we've had our conversations with the competent authorities, so we're in contact with all 27 now to understand what are their intentions around authorised representation. They're all coming back slightly differently. So some are drawing directly from the regulation. Some already insist on an authorised representative and they're not going to change that unless they're told to by the EU. Some don't currently request an authorised representative and aren't in any hurry to impose that requirement. So there's so much kind of stuff ongoing at the moment. There is also a consultation at the moment between the Council, the Parliament and the Commission that would see the requirement for member states to impose the requirement for authorised representation on other member states being kind of like put back until 2035. So that doesn't affect us, but that's just kind of like underway at the minute, but it doesn't impact what each member state does with reference to third countries like the UK. What I've done here is I've broken down, I've taken some of the core markets based on what our clients, their exports and their export markets. And I've done a deep dive into 8 countries. We've extended this recently because the GTD platform is going to offer EPR compliance across the top 15 countries as part of version 1. So we've got these 8 and then we've got another, whatever that is, 7. So what I've done for each country that we've looked at is I provided the governing legislation, because remember this is based on the waste directive. So upon that waste directive, each member state, in this case Belgium, imposed or transposed that into their national law and will have made some tweaks as a result of that. I've given the EPR scope, so effectively they have an EPR system in place for packaging, for batteries, for electrical and electronic equipments, but they also have EPR in place for mattresses, oils, tyres and photovoltaic panels. So they've already started to look at ESPR, the Eco Design for Sustainable Products, and based on their own waste framework within that member state, they've started to implement ESPR as well. So they're looking at not just packaging and packaging waste, they're looking at products now as well. I've given you the packaging scope. So it's composite packaging, so obviously packaging made up of several different materials, paper packaging for liquids, transportation packaging, bags for transportation, reusable packaging, special packaging, and service packaging. When I talk about service packaging, I'm talking about that kind of food contact products used for the service sector. So, you know, drinking cups, paper plates, and so on, and those kind of like polystyrene containers. All of the member states subscribe to the single-use plastic directives, and they all have a kind of partial ban in place at the minute. I've given you the national register, so where you need to register as a producer in Belgium if you determine that you are the producer of packaging in Belgium. And then I've given you a number of producer responsible organisations. So we will be aligning with Valapack for our compliance module for EPR, but I've also given you, if you are placing electronic goods on the market or mattresses, then I've given you kind of like the pros for those. There'll also be a pro for batteries as well, which I haven't listed here. There is a de minimis threshold in place for Belgium. I can't think off the top of my head what that is. It's not huge. I think it'll be something like 300 tons of packaging. If you're placing less than 300 tons of packaging on the Belgian market, then you don't have to pay any fees. I think it's something like that. And you still, that doesn't negate your obligations to register with a producer responsible organisation and register on the platform on the national register, but you will not have to pay any fees if it turns out that you placed less than 300 tons of packaging on the market in that 12 months. Those de minimis thresholds, where they exist, they are disappearing. All member states are pretty much removing them now. And what you'll find is that pros will bundle up, say, the first ton of packaging with their fees. So you pay the pros annual fees, and as part of that fee, you're covered for 100 ton of packaging placed on that market, a ton of packaging placed on that market for that 12 months. I've given some examples here of pro fees. So recycled cardboard, 20 euros per tonne. It's not a huge amount in terms of the recycled fees. It's more, to be honest, and when we hear from our clients, it's more that admin and the finding out who to register with and the pulling together of the reports. That's where the cost sits, because obviously your time has a cost. So the actual recycling costs are not massive. It's more the kind of like admin of managing this whole thing. In terms of labeling requirements, this is until we get the harmonized labeling requirements through via a delegated act attached to PPWR. Labeling is still very much down to the individual market. So with Belgium, you know, it states that labels must clearly indicate the type of material used, you know, so plastic, paper, glass, so that they can facilitate kind of proper sorting and recycling. They say that labels should also provide clear instructions on how to sort the packaging for recycling. They do use the Triman logo like France does, but it's not mandatory. And where there's kind of like wording or verbiage, then that should be language specific information. They do also mandate certain labeling around plastics, and this is quite common across all EU member states because of the Single-Use Plastic Directive. So there are 4 categories that must bear the turtle label, which basically indicates the presence of plastic and the environmental harm of improper disposal. So we see that with sanitary products, we see it with cleaning wipes, whether they be personal hygiene wipes, baby wipes, household wipes. We see it with tobacco products like cigarette filters and filters sold separately. And we see it with drinking cups as well. So they all must carry kind of like the turtle logo that indicates the presence of plastic and environmental harm of improper disposal. And then what Belgium does insist on is that labels must be in at least 3 of the official languages of Belgium, being French, Dutch, and German. Now that's Belgium. If we did a deep dive into another one, so let's flip straight forward to France. So I've given you again the French legislation, the EPR scope. So obviously they do have EPR in place for electronic waste, for batteries. France has probably gone the furthest into ESPR of any member state to date. So they're already doing EPR for textiles, for furniture, for tires, for a certain category of toys, print, paper, sports article, chemicals, and so on. This is well into ESPR category territory. Sorry, that you know, if you see my ESPR webinar, then ESPR has an associated working plan 2025 to 30, and those latter products on that slide are included in that working plan that we won't see actually come into force until 2027, 28, 29. So France is already doing that. And that's the thing with the directive as opposed to regulation. If a member state can determine that they can further enhance the robust nature of the regulation. They can't detract from its stringency, but they can make it more effective for the national market, then they can do that. So they can move further ahead in their agenda, even though other markets may not have done so far. In terms of packaging scope, so they have EPR for primary packaging, which, as I've explained here, is sales packaging. So that's the immediate packaging around the product itself. Secondary packaging is that grouped packaging. So if you've got 10 SKUs, each SKU has its own primary packaging, like a mug with an immediate cardboard box around it. And if you sell them in groups of 10, then the box that contains those 10 SKUs is your grouped packaging. And then your tertiary packaging is your transport packaging, like your pallets, your crates, your shrink wrap, all the rest of it. The first delegated act, incidentally, that we've seen come through for PPWR is removing pallet wrap and pallet straps out of scope of PPWR. The reusability of it, because initially they were in PPWR was mandating that pallet wrap and pallet straps be reusable, and the logistics sector had a huge uproar about it. And as a result, there's been a delegated act come through linked to PPWR that removes pallet wrap and pallet straps from that reusability requirement. Again, France has a single-use plastics ban partially implemented. The national register is a DAMI. And then the pro, so CITEO is the one that Global Trade Department will be aligning itself with and its portal with. That's paper and packaging. But I've also given, importantly, the main one for textiles, which is refashion. Most of the other member states don't have a pro for textiles. So you can see just how far advanced France is in this area. France doesn't have a minimum threshold. So, you know, as little as a gram of packaging or packaging waste on the French market attracts a fee. I've given you the pro fees here, and again, they have a different way of implementing these fees as well. So if you have less than 10,000 consumer sales units per year, then you can pay a flat fee of 80 euros for that. And then it gets a little bit more complicated, which if you're dealing with France and you're dealing with high volumes, then get in touch and I can explain exactly how it works. I won't bore you with the detail on this call. Packaging for France is a little bit more robust. So they mandate the Tryman logo with sorting instructions. That's mandatory for everything. So any packaging and packaging waste that goes into France for some time now has had to carry the Tryman logo. Those single-use plastics have to have that mandatory information on proper disposal and the whole thing about environmental impacts of incorrect disposal. And then single-use plastics like you know, sanitary towels, tampons, and so on and so forth have to be labelled accordingly with that plastic content. So that's France. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to give you an example of how it does vary. With Germany, I've given you the legislation, and as you would expect from Germany, I love dealing with Germany because they're so specific and they're so helpful. Any competent authority that you reach out to with Germany doesn't just give you the basic information, they give you chapter and verse. And for somebody like me that needs to know the insides and outsides of everything, they are so helpful. I wish everybody be like Germany. They are waiting at the moment to amend their German Packaging Act in line with PPWR, so there will be some changes, and they're usually the quickest to adapt to any changes that come through from the EU. They have their EPR scope as packaging, electrical and electronic equipments and batteries, so the standard kind of core ones that the EU's mandated for some time now. Packaging scope, so again, primary, that sales packaging, secondary, that group packaging, tertiary, that transport packaging, and then service packaging. So they have EPR in place for those food contact packaging, if you like. Again, they have partial ban. They've got partial ban on soup, sorry. I've given you the national registers. The pros here, I've given you several. You can probably work out what their specialities are. I believe that GTD is going to align with the green dot system, because that's a dual system. And you need to have currently in Germany an authorized representative for electronic waste and batteries, but not for authorized representative. I think that's changing. There's no de minimis. And then I've given you some producer responsible organisation fees based on the green dot system. This is last year's fees. So you can see already how they can tweak the fees according to what it is that they, maybe the costs of recycling some of that material, or the kind of material that they might want to kind of discourage producers from placing on that market. It's all that kind of carrot and stick type thing. In terms of labeling, they're a little bit less robust than the French, for example. So, but again, all of this is going to change, and that's why we can't wait to get the harmonized labeling through from the EU, which everybody will have to adhere to. So we'll have a set of pictograms, we'll have a set of core information. It will mean that as third countries, the packaging that we place on the EU market can be broadly the same for, to be compliant across the whole of the EU. But in Germany, you must put your registration number on there, which is kind of like your license number, as being part of a pro scheme. You must disclose the packaging type and the weight of that packaging, and the name of the waste disposal scheme, so the name of your producer responsible organisation, and the period of system participation, so they can see that your license is current or it's about to expire. And in terms of recycling and separation symbols on the product, that's completely voluntary. So whereas France imposes the requirement for the Triman logo, Germany, it's voluntary as to whether or not you give those sorting instructions. But all of this is set to change with the harmonized labeling coming through as a result of PPWR. So I won't go through all of them, but I've done for Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden. Now I wanted to come on to the role of authorised representatives. So the 12th of August is the kind of cut-off, it's a start date of the hard implementation of PPWR. So it's had a lot of the competent authorities across the EU think about the requirement for an authorised representative for packaging and packaging waste. As I said, some of them already insist on it. Some of them don't insist on it and aren't planning to change that. Some of them don't insist on it, but are looking to introduce it as of the 12th of August. They've all kind of like interpreted the very vague clause within PPWR. They've all interpreted it slightly differently. So the crux of it is that we'll have, as of the 12th of August, a greater number of member states insisting that third countries appoint an authorised representative if they're placing packaging waste on the market, but you'll still have some that don't. Certainly with the GTD platform that I'll talk about in a second, where we don't need to appoint a pro, we won't be appointing a pro, because it just adds to the cost of compliance for our clients. So we will continuously monitor the situation, and when when an authorised rep does become mandatory, then we will automatically register with one. But from the offset, we just want to have ARs in the countries where it's mandated, so we keep the compliance costs down for our clients. But essentially, the authorised rep is the one that submits the data to the producer responsible organisation and pays the fees, or organises for those fees to be invoiced directly to the manufacturer or the producer in the third country. They all work slightly differently, but it's just that person in the middle. And again, it goes back to the EU wanting to make sure that if they have to challenge anything around regulatory compliance, that they can challenge a local company or a local individual rather than a manufacturer in a third country. Yeah, it is what it is. And eventually EU member states will have to do this as well. It's just if this kind of draft proposal goes through and it gives them that stay of execution to 2035, you could argue that they are at an unfair advantage when compared to third countries. We'll have to see how that develops. It certainly hasn't been decided on yet. So what is GTD doing? So those of you may be familiar that we already offer GPSR and harmonized safety regulatory compliance via the GTD platform that we built in response to GPSR and the overwhelming volume of companies that just had nowhere else to go. They were just been faced with astronomical charges to appoint an authorized representative, and it was switching so many companies off to selling to the EU, which is just awful. So we developed a 24/7 self-service portal that allows clients to upload their own data, follow a kind of like a structure to uploading that data, and the output is technically their technical file, which many of the clients that were using the platform for the first time had never had to pull together a technical file before, and all of a sudden GPSR was requiring that. So we are extending the GPSR platform to cover compliance for a number of different pieces of regulation, mostly EU, but that is purely and simply because the EU drives a lot of this stuff, and then the rest of the world kind of plays catch up. So it will be supporting digital product passports, and it will provide full support for EU deforestation regulation at some point. But at the moment, some of those have been bumped slightly to allow us to provide pan-European compliance for EPR. So the idea is that our clients could be selling into multiple member states, but they have a single point of entry for their registration details and also their packaging volumes. They input that into the GTD platform, and the platform manages the rest. So it compiles that data and it will submit that data according to reporting deadlines. So like I said, they could be annually, they could be every 6 months, or in the case of Hungary, they could be monthly. The platform will basically submit those reports at the right time to the right member state. And in the background, what we've been doing is having discussions with authorized representatives where we need to appoint them, and discussing volume discounts based on the fact that we will be pushing business their way. So we're trying in the best possible way to keep those compliance costs down. Now, because at our heart we're regulatory specialists, we obviously know what is coming down the line in terms of ESPR and PPWR. So from day one, the platform will be fully PPWR and ESPR compliant. So at the moment, technically, if you registered with a producer responsible organisation, you're only required necessarily to submit data on the type of packaging. So, whether it's secondary, primary, tertiary, the makeup of that, the kind of material type of that packaging, be it glass, paper, whatever, and then the volume. Our platform will immediately from day one go that granular level detail, granular level, I can't talk today, level deeper. So it will ask for kind of like the composition, it will start to ask for the recycled content and all that kind of stuff, so that you might not have that data immediately. And even once it's fired across to the pro, or it's fired across to an authorized representative, they might not be able to report on it if the member state hasn't caught up yet. But the fact is you're gathering that data and you can go back retrospectively, which what that means effectively is for those member states where you have where they have implemented eco-modulated fees, then you will be able to take advantage of those sooner than if you weren't trapping that data. We'll be trapping that data on the product and on the packaging as well. Product initially, packaging initially and product latterly, in line with the plans for ESPR. But the idea is that our clients can kind of input their data, they might schedule to input it monthly, which would be our advice, that they download a CSV, and it's uploaded to our system. What we're doing at the moment is it's in design, it's in production. So for companies that are interested, then we're making a list of them, and they'll get a kind of custom demo of the platform in about a month's time. So if you are interested, then reach out. The idea is that it just makes it as simple and as cost effective to comply with EPR, and as a result PPWR and ESPR as possible. So there you go. I don't like that whole self-promotion thing, so I'll leave it there. So what do you do from today? I'm going to speed up a little bit here. So are you in scope? Well, do you place goods on the Northern Ireland or EEA markets? Do your products fall within the EPR categories? So go back to those slides on individual countries that I mentioned. And then are you a producer? So if you take, the rule of thumb is typically if you are selling to a business and they are importing the goods into the EU, then that business, be it an importer or a distributor, is typically the producer. If you're selling to a consumer in the EU, then you're going to be the producer. As the exporter, you're the producer. That's why a lot of our e-commerce sellers fall within EPR. But Incoterms can have an impact on this as well. So if you are a producer that's a manufacturer or a producer, say you're the producer of that, packaging waste, and you're selling to a business in the EU, but you're selling under DDP terms, then you are technically the producer, because you, as your organization, is the importer of record, and therefore you're the first business that's placing that packaging and packaging waste on the EU market. So it depends who you're selling to, the Incoterms that you're using. I would say they're two of the biggest drivers, and who is the first to place that product on the union market. And then you understand kind of like, are there EPR arrangements in your destination market? Well, I think I've explained now all 27 member states, and the 3 other states have EPR schemes in place now. Then you need to understand, is there a de minimis threshold governing your compliance? Your compliance, that's maybe a little bit misleading, governing your fee structure. So if there is a de minimis threshold, then you may not have to pay fees until you exceeded that threshold in terms of the volume of packaging, but it doesn't negate your requirement to register on the national register as a producer and register with a pro as well. So understand whether you're within scope first and foremost. And then calculation of levies. Well, as a minimum, you need to be tracking the type of packaging that you're placing on the market. So are you placing primary, secondary, tertiary product packaging on the market? What's the breakdown of those materials? What's the weight and quantity? And then as we move more towards PPWR and we await those delegated acts, then we'll have to be a lot more specific about material types and the recyclability and the reusability, and when it comes to plastics, the volume of recycled content in that plastics. And then understand the scheme administrators' fees. All of the big pros clearly disclose their fees and even have calculators as well. Obviously, some of them will be moving towards eco-modulation of fees. So the more information you can give around reusability, recyclability, volume of recycled content for plastic and so on, then the quicker you'll be able to take advantage of those eco-modulation of fees. And even if you're not the producer, even if you're selling to businesses that import the packaging and packaging waste directly, to make yourself more attractive, that focus on sustainable packaging should be paramount in your mind, because your business customers will be able to take advantage of those eco-modulated fees, which make you a little bit more attractive to deal with. Yeah, most pros publish their rates and have calculators. Where am I? So transition towards ESPR and PPWR, we as regulatory people are particularly happy that we're moving towards ESPR and PPWR. The waste framework's definition of waste was very woolly, a little bit ambiguous, and could lead to misinterpretations, and even in the EU has led to legal disputes as well. Obviously, implementation of the waste directive has been a little bit bitty across member states, how they've transposed that into their national law. And until August last year, Denmark didn't have anything in place at all. Under the old waste framework directive, there was no eco-modulation of fees. It was just one standard fee, whereas now it's kind of like, if you focus on making your packaging more sustainable, you're going to see benefits in terms of those eco-modulation of fees, or at least your business customers are going to. Labelling is not harmonised across the EU under the waste directive, which is a nightmare to try and guide clients, and a nightmare for clients that are trying to navigate it themselves. With PPWR, we'll get that harmonised labelling, which will reduce compliance costs significantly. And then also traceability of waste management processes. So there's a really big gap in the waste framework directive. It doesn't require the publishing of information to ensure the traceability of how fees are collected from the producers and how they're used to finance the waste management systems. That all changes. So with PPWR, there is a big part of compliance on the part of each national system to report that those fees that are being obtained from the producers, that they're being used fully and in the right area to help the EU meet its sustainability goals. And in terms of the collection, sorting, recycling, packaging, that arguably has been limited to the most valuable materials, that's easier to collect across the whole of the EU. So maybe from the commercial or the industrial segment, where it's been easier to collect and easier to report on, that changes now, and PPWR insists that it's kind of they're insisting on the packaging, the type of packaging and the composition of packaging, and really EPR is kind of like the implementation tool for ESPR. The EU has worked out over its time that companies are more likely to comply if there is an incentive, a financial incentive for them to comply. So EPR is very much the mechanism for the EU getting companies to comply with ESPR and PPWR. Global perspective, always like to cover this off. EPR is pretty much been adopted globally now. We're even seeing, as I say often in these calls, kind of like in the US, even under the Trump administration, there are still some states that are implementing their own EPR scheme, or slightly different. None of them are ever going to be as mature, robust, detailed, granular as EU regulation, but everybody aspires to have that, basically. So read this slide at your leisure. And then really the next steps. So if you're sitting here today thinking, oh my God, what do? I think the first thing is to audit your packaging as it stands at the moment. So, a full audit of your packaging, assess its recyclability, evaluate kind of like the recyclability of all packaging material used, considering both the material itself and its recyclability in existing waste management systems. So obviously, kind of mono materials are easier to recycle than composite materials. So, can you start making a switch to those kind of mono materials? Track any recycled content, determine, or have your suppliers determine the percentage of recycled content used in packaging materials. That's going to be paramount for plastics, not necessarily other types of material. look at the packaging design, look at opportunities to optimize that design for recyclability, reducing the amount of virgin materials, and you know, that's at the cornerstone of that whole eco design principle within the EU. We already see some of our packaging changing, right? So, you know, our kind of jiffy envelopes used to be bubble wrap, didn't they? That bubble wrap's now being taken out and replaced with kind of like a really annoying paper content. If you tear it, it's horrible, but it's fully recyclable. So already some packaging manufacturers are moving along those lines. The other thing that you're going to have to do as part of PPWR is to reduce the size of your packaging. So not to, you know, not to impact the packaging's ability to protect the product that is enclosed, but not to have that huge excessive packaging like those Amazon boxes, you know, that are yay big for something about that small inside. We don't see that anymore, so Amazon are clearly getting ahead of the curve here. So, you know, minimizing that packaging, because with PPWR there will be that minimization packaging delegated act that says that void packaging cannot exceed 50% of the overall weight of the packaging itself. Documentation and verification. This is the tricky part. Where you're buying your packaging in from overseas, or even from the UK, who are, you know, UK suppliers that are buying it in from overseas, you are going to have to start to gather that documentation. If you're making a statement like this is made from 100% recycled material, you need documentation to verify that. Not necessarily to give to the producer responsible organisation, not necessarily to give to anyone, but to have internally, so that should you be queried or audited, you can produce that to say that, you know, to substantiate your claims. Because when you're dealing with getting discounts or eco-modulated fees, much in the same way as when you're trading under a trade agreement and your customers are importing their goods without any duty, you need to be pretty clear on the origin of your goods. So everything comes back to, can you verify, and do you have the documentation to back up your claims? And then establish data collection systems. This could just be an Excel spreadsheet. Nobody's saying that you go out and buy a completely new system for something like this, you know, but you should be tracking the material types and the weights of all packaging material used, including that sent to households and also non-household packaging, because obviously with PPWR, they're looking at consumer and industrial packaging now. Categorize the packaging. So, you know, by its material type. Is it plastic? Is it cardboard? Is it metal? What's its intended use? Is it household or business? The more automated you can make that data collection, the better. So some of the larger businesses that we're talking to that have like EPR systems, they're going to be making changes against each individual SKU to be able to track the sustainability of the product itself and also the packaging, so that basically the reporting just becomes, oh, we're sold this many SKUs this month, therefore that breaks down into this packaging and this this product information. Stay informed and adapt to changes. We've got you covered. As and when the delegated acts come through, then we'll make you aware of those. But, you know, seize every bit of free information. Be really careful what you consume, because I have to say there is so much misinformation, particularly since AI, since ChatGPT and the others have come on the line. Some of the stuff that you read is like, wow. So always go back to source if you can. Always find the original directive or the original piece of regulation issued via Eurolex or via the EU Commission, and scrutinise that. But obviously we've got, I'm just getting this symbol now. Obviously we've, as and when we get more information and we get some concrete information, then we'll put on more of these sessions so that you're totally up to speed. I really don't know what's wrong with me today. Last two slides are the usual thing: available GTD support and, you know, opt-in. If there's any of you on this call today that aren't already part of our community and get notified frequently of these webinars and other stuff that we do, then just reach out and give us your first name, last name and email address, and we'll get you on the list. And there you go.